The rain had just stopped. Droplets lingered on the window, casting a somber shadow over the room, much like the silent grief that had lingered in my heart all this time. Everything seemed frozen in place since the day she left, the girl I once thought I'd spend my whole life with. Memories of her hadn't faded, they were still vivid, filling every empty corner of my mind. Yet she had chosen to leave, abruptly, like a fleeting breeze, leaving behind a hollow emptiness that could never be filled. Today, out of the blue, a letter arrived. It sat quietly on my desk, waiting, almost like a lingering trace of her spirit. I stared at the letter, too afraid to reach for it. How long had it been here? Why now, when I thought I'd buried every last emotion for her deep in my heart? The envelope was yellowed, and her handwriting was as delicate and familiar as ever, a gentle whisper from a distant memory. My hands trembled as I picked it up, feeling both a haunting familiarity and an unsettling strangeness. The girl I'd loved with everything in me, was gone forever. And yet here she was. Before me, present through her final words. Thousands of questions crowded my mind, but at the same time, a torrent of feelings I'd fought to bury surged up from within me. Finally, I opened the letter, took a deep breath, and began to read. My love, by the time you're reading this, I will have been gone for a while. I don't know when this letter will reach you, but I hope it won't add to your sorrow. I've promised myself that if you find this, it will be fate, a fate forcing us to face a truth we were never brave enough to speak. I stopped, taking in her words as if each letter was a drop of rain creating ripples in my heart. I tortured myself, telling myself over and over that I couldn't save her from that cruel disease, that I couldn't hold her back. I tried to believe that she'd chosen to leave for both our sakes, a way of setting us free. But the next lines made my heart stop. I didn't leave because of my illness, my love. There are things I've hidden from you, and even now I can't say it all. But I want you to know one thing, my love for you never faded. Please don't hate me, and don't try to find me in places where I'm no longer there. I know this will hurt you, but this was the only way I could protect you. I loved you more than life itself. I placed the letter on the table, my mind blank. What was she saying? Protect me? That's why she left. She sacrificed our love to protect me. From what? I couldn't even begin to imagine what she meant. Why didn't she tell me? I'd spent so long telling myself not to resent her, but now anger, confusion, and heartache crashed over me like a tidal wave, destroying everything I'd carefully tried to put to rest. That night, I didn't sleep. Her letter lay open on the table, while I sat there, silent and helpless. Every memory of her rose up in my mind one by one, clear as if it had all happened just yesterday. I remembered her smile, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at me, the times we'd sat together on the porch watching the rain. I even remembered those moments when she'd stare off into the distance, saying nothing. Back then, I thought she was just tired, fighting that awful illness. But now, looking back, I wondered if there had always been something hidden in her eyes that I had never noticed. I kept asking myself, what secret had she kept all this time? Why couldn't she tell me? My heart ached with a mixture of anger and helplessness. I wanted to punch the wall, to scream at the heavens for taking her away from me like this. She was gone, and I was left alone with nothing but unanswered questions. As dawn approached, I knew I couldn't live in the shadows of the past any longer. Her message was like a flickering light in the dark, illuminating a path I now had to walk. I didn't know where to start, but I was determined to find the truth. Her letter was her final call, urging me to understand the love and sacrifice she'd made for me. The next morning, I decided I would start my journey from the place we'd once belonged to together. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I knew one thing, I had to find traces of her, no matter how faint. I needed to understand what had truly happened. With her letter burning a hole in my pocket, I left my apartment and walked through the familiar streets, letting my feet guide me. They took me to the cafe where we used to spend endless afternoons together, laughing, talking, and dreaming of our future. The cafe was the same as ever. The walls were still painted that warm, dusky red she loved so much, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans. The same familiar music played softly, a nostalgic melody that echoed the memories I'd been trying to forget. I chose a table by the window, just as we always had, and let my gaze drift around the room. "Welcome back." The voice belonged to the cafe's owner, a quiet man in his 40s, with a kind but sharp gaze that seemed to see through everything. He was always polite, though he rarely spoke. Today, however, there was something different in his eyes as he looked at me, a shadow of hesitation, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. "You remember me," I said, surprised. He nodded, his eyes flickering with a mixture of sympathy and something else, a sadness that didn't belong to him alone. "It's hard to forget," he replied quietly. "The two of you were regulars here. Always happy, always together." He paused, then added, "I was sorry to hear about her." I clenched my hands around the coffee cup, feeling a rush of pain. It was strange to hear someone else acknowledge her absence, to bring up a grief I had been trying to hide. But I had to know more, even if the truth would hurt. "What do you remember about her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a moment before answering, as if carefully choosing his words. "She was always full of life when she was here," he said, his voice softening. "But there were times when she came alone, sat by the window, and stared out, lost in thought. I never asked her why, but she seemed troubled." My chest tightened. She'd come here alone. She'd never told me. Why would she come here, to the place we shared together, if not with me? "There was someone else," he continued, lowering his voice as if he feared someone might overhear. "A man who used to sit with her, not often, but enough that I noticed." Those words hit me like a blow. Another man? I couldn't believe it. I'd thought I knew her, thought our love was enough. She'd always looked at me as if I was her whole world. How could she have kept this from me? "I didn't mean to intrude," the cafe owner added gently, noticing the shock on my face. "But they were here together, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in silence." He had a serious look, a little menacing, if I'm honest. I couldn't help but worry about her. A man, serious and cold. Was that the reason she'd been so distant toward the end? Why she had that look in her eyes, the one I could never quite understand? "Do you remember what he looked like?" I asked, trying to suppress the anger and hurt boiling inside me. The owner nodded slowly. "He was older, maybe in his 40s. Sharp features, always in a suit, with a look that, well, he seemed like someone you wouldn't want to cross." He hesitated, then added, "There was one time when I overheard them. He told her something that made her start crying." My heart twisted painfully at the thought of her sitting in this very cafe, weeping in front of a stranger while I knew nothing of her pain. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. I only caught a few words, but it sounded like he was warning her. "He said something about her family's past, something she couldn't escape. He mentioned protecting someone, maybe you." "I'm not sure." He shook his head regretfully. "I don't know the details. All I know is that she looked terrified." My mind was racing. Her family's past. Protecting me? Could it be that she had gotten tangled up in something dangerous, something she didn't want me to know? The thought was dizzying. All this time, I'd thought I'd lost her to a cruel disease, yet here was a hint of something else, a secret she had carried silently, a truth I had been blind to. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice strained. I needed to leave, to get some air, to try and piece together this strange new puzzle. I stood, nodding at the cafe owner. He watched me with that same sad gaze, as if he knew the weight of the burden I now carried. Outside, I leaned against the wall, taking in deep breaths to calm myself. It was as if my entire world had shifted. Every memory I had of her, every moment we'd shared, suddenly took on a different light. How much had she been hiding from me? And why? What danger had she been so afraid of that she'd been willing to sacrifice everything, even us? As I walked back home, her words from the letter echoed in my mind: I didn't leave because of my illness. I left to protect you. That had sounded like a mystery, a heartbreaking excuse I couldn't make sense of. But now, I was beginning to see that it was much more than that. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start. Her family was scattered, and I barely knew them. She rarely spoke about them, and I'd always assumed it was because of the illness that had run through her family line. Now, I wasn't so sure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out her letter, reading her words over and over again. I'd thought this letter would be the last piece of her I'd ever have, but now it felt like the start of something more, perhaps a journey, perhaps a descent into an even deeper heartbreak. But I had no choice. I had to know. Whatever pain lay ahead, whatever secrets I would uncover, I had to find the truth. I walked through the empty streets, lost in thought. I had no idea who this man was, why he'd come into her life, or what he'd forced her to do. But I would find him. If there was a single thread connecting him to her, I would follow it to the end. The information I'd gathered at the cafe haunted me all night. Who was that man, and what had he told her to make her cry? Every question only added fuel to the fire of determination inside me. I knew I had to find him. I didn't know his name or anything else about him, but his image loomed large in my mind, as if he were waiting for me to confront him. It was this image that drew me back to the cafe the next day. The cafe owner, whose kindness had given me my first clue, greeted me with a hesitant look as I stepped inside. Back again? He asked, his voice a little surprised. I nodded. I need your help. Yesterday, you told me about the man who met her here. Do you know anything more about him? He hesitated, then motioned for me to follow him to the side of the room, away from the other customers. Leaning in, he spoke in a low, cautious tone. I don't know his name, but he left behind a business card once. She didn't take it, so I threw it away. But if you really want to find him, maybe there's another way. What do you mean? There's a private investigator I know, he continued. An old friend who sometimes helps people with sensitive issues. Maybe he could help you track down this man. I hadn't considered hiring an investigator. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I'd tried to move on, tried to let go of my pain, but now that I knew there was more to her story, I couldn't walk away. I needed someone who could help me piece together the fragments of her life I'd never seen. Thank you, I told him. Can you give me his contact information? He nodded, scribbling the number on a napkin and handing it to me with a look of encouragement. Be careful. Sometimes, the truth isn't what we hope it will be. I called the investigator later that afternoon. His name was Mr. Kane. His voice on the other end was brisk but polite, and he agreed to meet me the following morning at a quiet park just outside the city. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench, his gaze sharp and attentive. He was an older man, with silver hair and a face lined by years of experience. As I approached, he stood, offering a firm handshake. Mr. Kane, I greeted him. He nodded. So you're the young man with the mysterious letter and the missing pieces. Why don't you tell me the whole story? I took a deep breath, then told him everything, the love I'd shared with her, her sudden disappearance, her illness, and finally, the letter. He listened intently, his face unreadable, as I poured out every detail I could remember. When I finished, he leaned back, crossing his arms. This man, he said slowly. It's possible he was someone from her family's past. You mentioned she never spoke much about her family, correct? Yes. She only mentioned her parents once or twice. I never met them. She said they Passed away when she was young. Mr. Kane nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes, the most painful parts of our past aren't simply the things we leave behind, they're the things we try to escape. Perhaps this man was a remnant of something she tried to run from. But what could be so terrible that she would sacrifice everything to protect me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She loved me, I know she did. But she kept all this from me. Love can sometimes lead people to do unthinkable things, Mr. Kane said gently. She may have loved you so much that she didn't want you to suffer the same fate she feared. He then pulled out a notepad and jotted down a few things. I'll need a day or two to see what I can find. Tracking someone like this will take time, especially if he's as careful as he sounds. But I'll follow up with every lead I can find. I thanked him, feeling a surge of hope mixed with dread. Part of me wanted to run from whatever truth lay hidden, but I knew that I couldn't. This journey had already begun, and I had to see it through. 2 days later, Mr. Kane called. I could sense the urgency in his voice as he asked me to meet him at his office that evening. When I arrived, he was sitting behind his desk, a thick file in front of him. He gestured for me to sit, his expression serious. "I've found him," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Or at least, I've found out who he is. His name is Raymond Cole, a businessman with a rather dark past. He was deeply involved with your girlfriend's family." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. It seems her family wasn't quite what they appeared to be. Years ago, they were connected to some dangerous people, the kind you wouldn't want to cross. When her parents died, she was left in the care of distant relatives. But this man, Raymond, continued to act as a guardian of sorts, making sure she never tried to escape the family's shadow. I believe that's why she was so afraid. So he controlled her? I asked, horror dawning on me. Essentially, yes, he said. And when she met you, that control was threatened. I believe he warned her to stay away from you, to keep you out of the family's mess. That would explain the letter, her way of protecting you from the danger she'd grown up in. I sat back, struggling to process everything. The girl I'd loved, the girl I thought I knew, had been trapped all along, held prisoner by a past she couldn't escape. And now that I knew the truth, I could feel the weight of her sacrifice even more deeply. Where is he now? I asked, barely able to contain my anger. He's a difficult man to find, Mr. Kane admitted. But if you're set on confronting him, I'll keep looking. I nodded, feeling a dark determination take hold of me. I had to face Raymond Cole, not just for myself, but for her. I needed to understand the full story, even if it meant facing the man who'd made her life a living nightmare. Leaving Mr. Kane's office, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. The life I'd shared with her had been real, but everything I thought I knew about her was built on a foundation of secrets and lies. I had loved her with my whole heart, but I had never truly known her pain, her fear, or the sacrifices she'd made. Now, it was up to me to uncover the rest of her story. The days following my meeting with Mr. Kane were a blur of restless thoughts and simmering anger. My mind replayed everything I'd learned, every agonizing detail of her silent suffering, and every word from her letter. She'd loved me enough to walk away, but now that I knew the truth, I couldn't let her sacrifices be in vain. The only way forward was to find Raymond Cole and confront him myself. Mr. Kane and I kept in close contact, and after days of relentless searching, he called with a breakthrough. "Raymond has been sighted in a nearby town," he informed me over the phone. "He owns a private property just outside the city, secluded and heavily secured. It's not an easy place to get into, but I have a plan." The resolve in his voice matched the determination I felt. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing myself for, the chance to face the man who had controlled her life, who had stolen her peace and ultimately, her future. I agreed to meet Mr. Kane the following evening, prepared to take whatever risks were necessary. The night was dark, shrouded in clouds that cast long shadows over the deserted road leading to Raymond's estate. The property was as isolated as Mr. Kane had described, hidden behind tall iron gates and surrounded by a thick wall. Beyond the gates, the faint glow of lights spilled out from a grand house nestled in the darkness. I felt a chill at the sight, knowing that this was the place where her secrets had been locked away. "Are you ready?" Mr. Kane asked, glancing at me as we parked a short distance from the estate. He had arranged a way for us to slip past the guards, using the cover of darkness and a carefully timed distraction he had planned. "Yes," I replied, steeling myself. He nodded and handed me a small flashlight. "Once we're in, stay close. This man is dangerous, but he's also calculated. He won't do anything drastic unless provoked." With that, we moved quickly and silently toward the side entrance. Mr. Kane's contact had left a small gap in the security patrol, giving us just enough time to slip through unnoticed. We followed a narrow path around the side of the property, hidden by trees and shrubbery. The air was thick with tension as we crept closer to the house. Our footsteps muffled by the damp earth. As we reached the rear entrance, Mr. Kane pulled a keycard from his pocket, a tool he'd acquired from an inside source. He swiped it across the reader, and the door clicked open. We slipped inside, my heart pounding with each step as we entered the heart of Raymond's domain. The interior of the house was cold and sterile, every surface pristine and immaculate. The halls were dimly lit, casting eerie shadows that stretched along the walls. Mr. Kane led the way, his movements calculated and precise. We made our way through the house, finally reaching a study at the end of a long hallway. He gestured for me to wait as he pressed his ear to the door, listening carefully. After a few seconds, he turned to me. "He's alone," he whispered. "Now's your chance." I took a deep breath, steadying myself before stepping forward and opening the door. Inside, Raymond Cole sat at a large mahogany desk, his gaze fixed on a stack of papers. He looked up, his expression unreadable as he registered my presence. His features were as sharp as the cafe owner had described, cold eyes, high cheekbones, and a presence that seemed to command the room. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "I'm the one you should have met a long time ago," I replied, my voice filled with the anger and sorrow that had been building within me. "I'm the man she loved. The man she left to protect. I'm here because you stole her from me." A flicker of recognition crossed his face, and he sat back in his chair, observing me with an air of indifference. "Ah. So you're the boy she thought she could save." I told her that was a foolish idea. His words stung, but I held my ground. "Why did you control her? Why did you threaten her to stay away from me?" Raymond sighed, as if tired of revisiting a painful memory. "You don't understand. She was born into a family that owed debts that can't simply be ignored. Her parents, despite their best intentions, left her with a burden she couldn't escape." "What kind of burden?" I demanded. "Enough that she had to sacrifice her happiness, our future." He narrowed his eyes, his gaze piercing. "Yes. Her family was involved in matters far beyond what you could comprehend. Her father crossed powerful people who don't simply forgive and forget. When he died, those debts fell on her. I took it upon myself to ensure that she fulfilled her obligations, nothing more, nothing less." "She was innocent," I shot back. "She didn't deserve this." "Innocence doesn't absolve responsibility," he replied coldly. "I warned her that being with you would only complicate things, but she was stubborn. She thought she could build a new life, that love could erase her family's past. But the world doesn't work that way." I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of rage. "You're wrong. She was brave, braver than you'll ever understand. She sacrificed everything to protect me, to keep me safe from this twisted legacy. But I'm here now, and I want you to know that I won't let her memory be tainted by your lies." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. And what exactly do you intend to do? Challenge me? Fight me? She's gone, and no amount of bravado will bring her back. The truth of his words hit me hard, but I refused to back down. I don't care about your threats or your family's past. I just want you to know that you didn't win. She may be gone, but her love and her courage are still here, and I'll make sure they live on. Raymond's expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might retaliate. But instead, he simply shrugged, as if I were an insignificant nuisance. Believe what you want, he said dismissively. But her choices were her own. If she chose to protect you, it was because she was willing to sacrifice herself. If that brings you comfort, so be it. I took a step closer, meeting his cold gaze with defiance. She was worth more than anything you could ever understand. And I promise you, I'll make sure her story isn't one of tragedy, but one of strength and resilience. You may have tried to control her life, but you'll never control her memory. With those final words, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving Raymond sitting alone in the cold, hollow silence of his house. I didn't need his answers or his justifications. I had all I needed, her memory, her love, and the truth of her sacrifice. She had been strong. Stronger than I'd ever known, and now it was up to me to honor that strength. Leaving the house, I felt an odd sense of peace, as if I had finally laid a piece of her spirit to rest. She had faced darkness, endured pain, and made impossible choices, all for the sake of love. She had given me a gift, one that would forever remind me of her courage. And as I walked back into the night, I knew I would carry her memory with me, not as a burden, but as a testament to the depth of her love and the strength of her spirit. Her story wasn't over, it was now a part of me, guiding me forward, a light that would never fade. In the days after my confrontation with Raymond Cole, the world felt strangely quieter. I'd finally peeled back the layers of her past, unveiling secrets that had haunted her and shaped the life she tried to leave behind. Though the pain of her absence was still fresh, a sense of peace had settled within me, like I'd completed the part of her journey she couldn't finish herself. But I also knew my work wasn't done. Her story, the story she'd entrusted to me through her love and sacrifice, deserved to be told. She was more than a memory haunted by shadows. She was vibrant, resilient, and selfless in a way that I now felt compelled to share. I decided that the best way to honor her was to bring her story to light, so the world could see the beautiful person she was. I started small, gathering every piece of her I could find, photos, letters, notes she'd left me during our years together. I read through them carefully, reliving each moment, piecing together her words and memories. It was both painful and healing, a chance to feel close to her again. In those quiet hours, her presence seemed to fill the room. Like a whisper of warmth that chased away the chill of her absence. As the weeks passed, I knew that a book, a memoir of sorts, was the only way I could truly do her justice. I wanted people to see the side of her that I had loved, her kindness, her laughter, the way she could light up a room with a single smile. I wanted the world to know that beneath the secrets, she was a person who had fought valiantly for love, even when it meant sacrificing her happiness. Writing wasn't easy. Each word felt like a piece of my soul poured onto the page. But I knew that if I wanted her to live on in the memories of others, I had to be brave enough to share her whole story, even the painful parts. Months went by as I poured myself into the project, guided by the love and resilience she had shown me. The book took shape slowly, chapter by chapter, until I felt it was ready. It was raw and honest, capturing both the joy and the tragedy of our love. In every sentence, I tried to bring her spirit to life. Finally, after endless drafts and rewrites, the manuscript was complete. I held the printed pages in my hands, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It felt as though a piece of her had finally been freed from the shadows of her past, allowed to shine in a way she never could while she was alive. I knew that sharing the book with the world would be the final step in honoring her memory. After weeks of searching, I found a publisher who believed in her story as much as I did. They promised to help me bring her tale to life, to share it with those who might be touched by her strength, her courage, and her love. The book was published on a crisp autumn day, and I attended the launch event in a small bookstore nestled in a quiet corner of the city. Friends, strangers, and even a few people who'd known her gathered to hear her story. As I stood in front of them, reading the opening lines of our shared journey, I felt her presence beside me, as if she were standing there, silently cheering me on. The words came easily, each sentence a tribute to her memory. The audience listened intently, their expressions shifting between smiles and tears. I realized that her story had finally found a place in the hearts of others, weaving itself into the lives of people she had never met. When I finished reading, there was a quiet moment before the applause began. It wasn't just a celebration of the book, but a tribute to her, a woman who had lived and loved with such fierce bravery, even in the face of impossible odds. After the event, as people lingered to ask questions and share their thoughts, I found a moment of solitude by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The evening light bathed the room in a warm glow, casting soft shadows that reminded me of her. In that quiet moment, I whispered a final goodbye. She would forever be a part of me, her love etched into my heart, her story a guiding light in my darkest moments. And though she was gone, she had left behind something that could never fade, the courage to love, to forgive, and to remember. The darkness that had once surrounded her story had lifted, replaced by a light that would burn brightly. For as long as I carried her memory, she was, and always would be, the love of my life, the woman who had shown me the true meaning of sacrifice and resilience. And as I left the bookstore that night, I knew that her story would continue to touch lives, just as she had touched mine. She was finally free, and so was I.